Join us this evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for the concluding presentation in our online series, How I Discovered Austrian Economics. Our presenter is none other than the co-host of Libertarian Angle, Richard Ebeling. I hope you'll join us. Just register at our homepage at fff.org and you'll receive a Zoom link. What were the contributions of the classical economist Jean-Baptiste to the study of economics? Join Richard and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show on the internet here that brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. And I'm joined, as I usually am, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners. We're doing this at a slightly different time of the day, so the regulars are not seeing me in my office attire. I'm actually relaxing at home in my home office with my books around and my stamp collection of inflation stamps of Germany and Hungary, and the other one there is an actual assignat. That is one of the inflation monies from the French Revolution. This one issued in 1793.
Wow, that's impressive. Where'd you get that one?
Given as a gift.
Yeah. That's nice. Well, thanks for the tour. That's you've got a little extra bonus here.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Richard, we're discussing the classical economists, and we're actually on part 3, which was what was going to be a one-session segment on the classical economists, and but I'm getting some good feedback, and so we will continue. We started out talking about the prelude to the classical economists: Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, the physiocrats in France. And so then after we dealt with that prelude to the classical economists, you started talking about David Ricardo, one of the principal classical economists. You talked about the law of comparative advantage and other principles that Ricardo gave. So then why don't we take it from there and let's go into part 3. And who are you going to talk about among the classical economists this week?
Right. I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about some of the French contributors to classical economics. Of course, when people who have any knowledge of economics and history of economic ideas think of the classical school, they tend to think of the British. And that's quite understandable. There had been David Hume, there had been Adam Smith. They were all the inspirations for the late 18th and certainly the 19th century British economists, some of whom we talked about last time, Thomas Malthus and particularly David Ricardo. Following Ricardo in the middle part of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, who I will allude to a little bit later on. But there was another branch of what we now call classical economics, and that was the French economists. Some are fairly well known, some are less well known. Let me start off with the economist that perhaps is most well known from that French period, and that is Jean-Baptiste Say, S-A-Y, Jean-Baptiste Say. He is most famous for his what is now called Say's Law. And I'll start with that, but then extend understanding Say's views on things. There was the argument, partly due to Thomas Malthus, by the way, that economies can get into periods of overproduction. There could be a glut of many goods for which there was not sufficient demand to take all the productions created off the market, and that this could set an economy into a recession and unemployment among the working class. Say was one of the early economists who very concisely and persuasively, in my view, argued against that. He basically argued that, yes, there can be an oversupply of shoes, there can be an oversupply of hats or bananas or glasses, because businessmen, entrepreneurs, enterprises may have overestimated the demand for a product that they have devoted resources in manufacturing, including employing labor, and that when they bring the good to market, they discovered that given what they thought was going to be the market demand and what they thought would be the price that consumers might be willing to pay for it, they have been overly optimistic. And that, in fact, at the initial price that they set, they're left with unsold inventory, uh, goods on the store shelves. And it may require them, with this over optimism, to have to cut back production and maybe let some of their workers off. There could always be a mismatch because of wrong expectations and beliefs about market conditions that results in these types of oversupplies of things. But Say also argued that if there's too much of one good at whatever price the supplier initially sets for it, that means that consumers are wanting to spend their money in some other direction. So if the supplier of shoes, for example, has overestimated the demand and has produced too much at the price he initially sets for it, that means that consumers are spending the money in some other direction. Maybe instead of an extra pair of shoes, they're interested in buying an extra coat, which means that too many resources have gone into shoe manufacturing and not enough resources have gone into coat manufacturing. So there's a shortage of coats. And in this case, markets can be corrected by shifting resources where consumer demand has turned to be less than anticipated, and moving those resources into those sectors of the economy where consumer demand has turned out to be greater than expected. And through appropriate shifts and adjustments in supplies in that way, and adjustments to bring prices into balance, price down where entrepreneurs were over optimistic, and raising prices where demand has turned out to be greater than expected, markets can be readapted. And Ricardo said, if you understand this, you realize is that there really cannot be a general glut in the economy as a whole. Because as long as there are unsatisfied wants and desires, and certainly individuals, if you look at your own life, individuals realize that no matter how much their income, their means to achieve goals gets increased, you always think of more things, better things, new things, imagine things that you would like to satisfy, which previously you could not. And that therefore the idea that at any time there could be an overglut or oversupply of everything was inconsistent with the very concept of scarcity. As long as there are unsatisfied wants, existing, imagined, or things that emerge in the future, there will always be work for hands to be done, as long as the patterns of supply are matching correctly the patterns of demand. And prices and wages appropriately adjust to bring the two sides of the market in these various sectors of the economy into balance. This is a profound argument. If rightly understood, it basically undermines the 20th century rationale of John Maynard Keynes's, quote, Keynesian economics, that an economy can get caught in a period of extended unemployment and lethargic production because there's not enough demand for output. Now, I said that one other aspect of the classical economists would be John Stuart Mill. Some people said, okay, we understand Jean-Baptiste Say's argument and what later became known as Say's law, as this concept began to be coined as. But wait a minute, I can understand there could be too much of one good, too much of another good, but people earn income and they use that money income to buy other goods. But what do you do in a situation where people have earned income, but they don't turn around and spend all the income they've earned? In other words, they hoard money. They hoard money. And if people are not spending all that they've earned, then there is a deficiency potentially of a lack of demand for many, many goods, because people prefer to hold on to the money they've earned previously rather than demanding it goods as consumers after having earned it as suppliers. Couldn't there be a general glut because of this? And the response to this was given by John Stuart Mill in an essay that appears in a collection of his called Unsettled Problems of Political Economy, which was published in 1844. Though I understand the particular essay in which he's defending Jean-Baptiste Say was written a bit earlier, but never published until in that collection. And Mill says, well, the problem that Say's critics raise has an answer. And that answer is, let us assume that money is a desirable commodity. People have a demand for hats. People have demand for shoes and bananas and corn and glasses and shirts and everything else. They also have a demand for money. And there may come circumstances of uncertainties in the market, concerns about future market conditions, that people are hesitant to spend all that they have earned precisely because they want to see how things play out. But if one understands that money is as much a commodity as any other, it has a demand and a supply, then if people are choosing to hold more money and spend less money, then that shows that there's an increased demand to hold money and a decreased demand for all other things. That too has its solution. And what is that solution? Well, the prices of many other goods need to decline to bring the balance back, because as prices decrease, the value of money in your pocket rises. And as the value of money in your pocket rises, it diminishes your need or desire or impulse to hold as many cash balances as you had before, because a smaller cash balance of money will now satisfy the same demand you have for money because prices are lower. You can buy more with each per unit of money. So that, again, as long as prices are flexible and adaptive and any relative adjustments are brought into proper balance, if you view money as a desired commodity, then prices must fall, the value of money will rise, commodity prices will rebalance, and then full employment and full production can be restored. And it's very interesting that when Keynes, in his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, his 1936 book, attempts to demolish Say's law, Say's argument, he quotes a passage from John Stuart Mill. But what he does, he leaves out the next two sentences that, if he had quoted those two sentences, would have showed that Keynes's argument against Say was incorrect. That's sometimes referred to as quoting someone out of context to try to make your own point. And that was that. And in fact, the mark of one of the marks of a good economist in the 19th century was someone who understood the logic of Jean-Baptiste Say's argument, why there can never be an excess supply of everything and therefore a deficiency of demand or a glut of all goods. And in fact, if you go through the books of many economists, they used to call them principles of political economy books. Basically, it was economics textbooks. If you read a lot of those in the 19th century, many of them have a chapter on the fallacy of gluts. And they all basically, in their own words, restate Jean-Baptiste Say's argument. And that was the mark of a good economist. There can never be an oversupply of everything. Markets work as long as they're adaptive and adjusting to the actual conditions on supply and demand. And that is a profound argument, in my opinion. But what Say does is more than that. And that is, he was in many ways a principled and extremely persuasive advocate for the free market economy. If you go through his Principles of Political Economy, which came out shortly after the fall of Napoleon in 1815, what you find here is that he constantly is making the arguments why government interventions fail, why price controls are counterproductive, why barriers to international trade harm all participants on both sides of the trading relationship. He even will defend the smuggler, as other classical economists did. You know, the illegal trader who sneaks goods across the borders. And the reason being is that, what is a smuggler? He is someone who is satisfying demands for goods internationally that governments won't allow people to freely buy and sell. And therefore, the smuggler is, as another classical economist named Nassau Senior said, the heroic reformer. He precedes the changing of the policies by showing that they're unworkable, by getting goods around the custom houses at the borders. Say was brilliant in that as well. And then another thing about Say that is worth mentioning is that while, as I talked about, both Adam Smith and particularly Ricardo last time, suffered from this false notion that the value of goods in the marketplace was based upon the quantity of labor that had gone into them, the labor theory of value. Say walks back from that. He says that goods must eventually have and be demonstrated to have utility, personal subjective value to the user. Otherwise, there's no basis for supply and demand at all. Now, he does not take it as far or logically, consistently, conceptually, as the later economists like the Austrians, like Karl Menger, Bavrik, and others did with the concept of marginal choice and marginal decision making. But he was an advocate of saying that value begins with the choices and the value and beliefs of the individual, not something objective as merely a quantity of labor that's gone into a product. So he's much more subtle in that. Now, the French tradition was profoundly insightful. And the next one I want to mention is one that I would think at least some of the people in our audience, Jacob, would have heard about, and that is Frederick Bastiat.
All right, hang on a second, though.
Okay.
Let's put some things into perspective here. So David Ricardo was an Englishman?
Yes.
And so was John Stuart Mill?
Yes.
Okay, so...
They were British.
British. Okay, so did they work at the same time or live at the same time as Jean-Baptiste Say? And was there any interrelationship between them? Did they understand each other's arguments? Was there that type of thing going on?
Excellent question. Thank you for raising it, because I wouldn't have thought of doing it. Thank you. In fact, yes. When Malthus was making his arguments about, there can be a general glut, a deficiency of demand that causes unemployment, Jean-Baptiste Say replied to him in letters to Mr. Malthus. He writes a series of imaginary letters to Malthus. Now, he did correspond with Malthus in the real world, but these were imaginary letters that he was publishing to show why Malthus was wrong. and Jean-Baptiste Say and David Ricardo communicated. If you look through, there's a collected works of David Ricardo, including about 2 or 3 volumes of his letters with many people, obviously. Among his correspondence was Jean-Baptiste Say. They knew about each other. They admired each other. They didn't always agree about everything, obviously, but yes, they knew all about each other. Now, John Stuart Mill was a little later than that. You see, John Stuart Mill was the son of James Mill. And James Mill was the one who inspired David Ricardo to write his book, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which came out in 1817. Now, James Mill, being a follower of Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher, was determined to make, with his own son, the most rational human being that had ever existed on the planet. So by the age of 3, got this? The age of 3, John Stuart Mill, his son, could speak and read not only English, but French, Greek, and Latin at the age of 3. No playtime for Johnny. Everything was you wake up in the morning and you study to make you nothing but this perfect intellectual mind, the rational mind. And one of these things is that he had his son, John Stuart, read David Ricardo's book when it came out. And then they'd walk around the garden around their home. And John Stuart had to write these little summaries of Ricardo's argument. And James Mill took all of these little summaries that his son had prepared and then put them together and published his own book based upon his son's notes. It's disgusting. But in fairness, James Mill was a powerful intellect in his own. He wrote a lot of interesting things. But the problem was in that making John Stuart Mill this perfect human mind. The result was that when he was I guess he was in his early 20s, John Stuart Mill went into a terrible emotional breakdown. Total emotional. Okay, no friends of his own age. Forget about girls, right? No. You have to control your hormones because you're reading another economics book. It sounds sarcastic, but if you read Mill's autobiography, it's almost like that. So he had a nervous breakdown, and it made him rethink his life. While he still remained philosophically utilitarian. Of course, he loved his father, admired his father and Ricardo. He felt that you have to get in touch with your feelings, your softer side. The end result of that is that he finally met a woman who was his intellectual companion, a woman named Harriet Taylor. The problem was Harriet Taylor was already married to an older man, and she was loyal to her husband. There was no suggestion that there was, quote, hanky panky between Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill. But her life with her husband was different than her life with John Stuart Mill. They were like inseparable companions. They would travel throughout Europe together, and they would stay in separate rooms. Okay, if you get my drift here, separate rooms. And while they're in separate rooms, they write letters to each other that they'd read the next day. And finally, being older, her husband finally passed away. And after an appropriate time of mourning, Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill eventually married, and a very happy marriage, as from all the historical and biographical accounts. But it is uncertain as to whether, even if they were, after they were married, if they ever did it. I mean, the big it, where they ever did it, if you get my drift here. There's a major question in all biographies of John Stuart Mill. Did he ever know the physical act of love? And we don't know that because it seemed to be like a purely platonic relationship. The other thing I would just mention about Mill, and this is going to lead to part of what I'm hoping we'll discuss in part 4, and that is Karl Marx. Mill is the in-between. John Stuart Mill is the in-between between the classical defense of laissez-faire and the rising socialist movement. And from all accounts, including a book that Friedrich Hayek wrote about Mill and Harriet Taylor, she seems to have been the greatest influence in veering him towards a more socialist direction and away from the more or less laissez-faire position that he had held as a younger man. So obviously she worked on him in various ways. But while that was the trend that was emerging in the later Mill, among the French economists, this was not the case. The French economists throughout the 19th century, in general, remained consistently classical, liberal, and laissez-faire. And that is captured, as I was suggesting, in the next figure I'd like to briefly talk about.
All right, well, let me ask you something about Mill, though.
Okay.
My recollection of Mill is that he was one of the most highly educated people in history, but with no degree. Is that right?
He was homeschooled. He never went to school. His only education is his father's tutorials and tutors that were hired to help him learn, obviously, different subjects. No, he was an early student of the homeschooling movement, if you want to put it that way. Yes, he never went to college. He never went to the university. But by his middle years, he was internationally recognized as not just a profound economist, but as a social philosopher. And I should mention this in this context as well. And that is because of his famous essay on liberty, which came out in 1859. This remains a classic in political philosophy, including among liberals. And the reason is that he says that an individual should have the liberty to do almost anything he desires in his thinking and his acting, as long as it does not harm another individual or encroach upon that other individual's similar rights. He makes the case for freedom of speech by saying, is that which one of us can claim to have sufficient knowledge to think that we could never make an error or a mistake? Few of us can make that claim. And that means that we want open discourse, open debate, open conflict of views, precisely because others might see elements of the truth that we don't, or even might see all of the truth that is quite different from the fallacies we've gotten ourselves into. And not only does it correct our thinking, but it may find out that you have some of the right understanding of truth and the other person has the right understanding of truth. And you bring those two parts together and the two of you have come closer to understanding what truth is. And that itself means that the inescapable ignorance of the human being, the limited knowledge of any human being, requires him to show the humility, the acceptance of his own limits, in presuming to have the arrogance to tell others what they can speak, what they could write, how they could interact with each other, as long as there's a high degree of voluntarism in those relationships. I'm obviously doing a very unfair summary of the essay. It's a fairly lengthy monograph, but almost every serious course on political philosophy, I'm not sure what it is in the wokeness era, but before wokeism, it would be very surprising if any student took a general political philosophy course or majored in political science and had not had at one point or another had either an excerpt or the entire essay on liberty assigned to them by John Stuart Mill.
Okay. Well, we're running out of time, so why don't we save Bastiat for the next session? But because I got a couple more questions.
Okay.
So on Mill, if people wanted to read something representative by Mill, would you recommend On Liberty to them?
Yes, on his political philosophy, I would definitely say that. I also should mention something else, since we're talking about something beyond his wider liberal philosophy. He was highly anti-imperialist and highly critical of those who attempted to deny equal rights to non-whites. I'll just mention briefly two examples of this. In 1863, in Jamaica, there were several Jamaican blacks who were put on trial, supposedly for an insurrection, which the evidence showed had not occurred, but had merely been more or less peaceful demonstrations against the abuses of the colonial British government in Jamaica. The British forces there opened fire. Several people were killed. And the governor of Jamaica was brought to London to stand trial. Now, some of the conservatives, such as Thomas Carlyle and others, the Tories, supported the governor. There are these inferior people and they have to be kept in their place, and we need an empire. On the other hand, John Stuart Mill joined people like Alfred Lord Tennyson and Herbert Spencer in speaking out and saying that it doesn't matter who you look like and what the color of your skin is, you are a human being, and your civil liberties and rights, including peaceful association and grievances, should be allowed in the British Empire. And he was a strong advocate for liberty. He also said that, yes, he understands the right of secession. People should be able to choose if they want to remain part of a wider political entity. And he said this at the time of the American Civil War, but he said, but did the 4 million slaves in these Confederate states have a chance to vote and express their preference and will of whether they wanted to secede, be part of a secession state to uphold slavery, or whether they preferred to remain in the Union with an opportunity to be free men? So he was deeply anti-slavery in the American context as well. Therefore, he had a wide consistency in this. Some people point out about Mill that he's also sort of a bridge towards socialist ideas, because in a famous passage in his Principles of Political Economy, the first edition of which came out in 1848, he says there are laws of production, but there are no given laws of distribution. The laws of production are fixed by nature. You know, if you mix this much fertilizer with this much soil and you have this much irrigation, this is, given the weather, the size of the crop you're going to get. And if you want to produce a machine, you have to have this kind of inputs and labor supply to be able to produce the desired product. They're sort of like the laws of recipes to make goods in the kitchen, right? To make a pie. But there's no laws of distribution. Once the pie is made, we can cut up the slices in any way and decide to distribute it to whoever we want. And that's often been said that, you see, he's the one who opens the door to the welfare state. And I don't deny that. But he said that the idea that society should take that attitude about distribution depended upon a change in human nature that was unlikely to be seen in any foreseeable future. We're all altruistic. We have no attempt to use the government at other people's expense. We only want to do good for humanity. there's no greed, there's no corruption, there's no abuse of power. So he's imagining a little world where somehow human nature was different than it was like 2,000 years from now. But he says, look here, there is human nature today. And we know what motivates people. They need incentives. And one of the incentives is being able to keep the fruits of your labor. And that therefore there is, in the given human nature in the institutions of real world society, as much as laws of distribution. That is, if you want to have people have the incentives to produce, then you have to basically let them keep what they have manufactured, the fruits of their labor. And in those parts of the book where he says, let's hard-headed, right, man as he exists, he's against government intervention in most avenues. He is highly critical of the abuses that concur with redistribution of wealth. He is a strong advocate of the gold standard against paper money inflation, and believes very strongly in the principle of free trade. So he basically believes in free markets, has a very hesitant view about any redistribution of wealth, believes in a sound monetary standard, and is a devotee of free trade. So while Mill has his errors and problems, and others have used him for their purposes, and he's not guiltless in those parts of the book, he's a stronger advocate of the free economy and individual liberty than some classic liberals or libertarians, in my opinion, give him credit for.
All right. You mentioned Thomas Malthus. He was another British.
Yes, he was a minister in the Anglican Church.
All right, and of course he would be considered one of the classical economists as well.
Correct. In that generation, along with Ricardo and James Mill.
Okay, and would you just give a little quick synopsis of who Thomas Malthus was then?
Well, I explained a little bit last time. He was an ordained minister who was following in his father's footsteps. But as I mentioned last time, this man named William Godwin published in 1895, 1894, a book called Political Justice. And Godwin had argued that all of the maladies of society, poverty, inequality, corruption, greed, all was due to the institution of private property. When people could own things on their own, they would have this incentive to want to grab more at the expense of their neighbors. And therefore there arose social injustice. But it is possible for us to change the institutions of society from private property to communal property relationships. And in changing the institutions of society, will change the motivational forces on the individuals. So if you change the institutions from private property, where you have self-interest, greed, possessiveness, acquisitiveness, to more communal shared property, a version of communism, you will change human nature. We're in it together. We're all concerned with the outcome and betterment of our brothers and our fellow man. We'll be so concerned for humanity. We'll have less of a sex drive because we're afraid that the population will explode too much, and people will outrun the food supply. But once we change from private property to communal property, man will change, be transformed in his persona, his psyche, and that will create a society of sort of like a platonic, utopia of other orientedness and peace and love, where everyone would just share and want to help each other and produce in common for the common good, with no self-interest guiding it. Malthus considered this nonsense. And as I think I mentioned last time, he begins the first edition of his essay on population, which was published in 1797, by saying two postulates. And the first postulate is man has the necessity for food, which has not changed and will not change. And the second postulate is that the passions of the sexes for each other are the same today as it has been in all of recorded in the past, and will remain so in any imaginable form in the future. So you have two things. People need to eat, and people have sex drives. And that's not likely to change, regardless of what you do with the institutions. And that means that the man always runs the danger of population numbers running ahead of increased food supplies, and that therefore the population will always be sort of through pestilence and hunger and too many mouths to feed relative to the food supply, resulting periods of famine and poverty until the number of people gets more imbalanced with the available food supply. And that therefore the idea that you can create a bountifulness utopia is impossible. And as I mentioned last time, this caused a huge uproar. Oh my God, humanity can never improve itself. Oh, it's a dismal science that he's propagating. That's a phrase of Thomas Carlyle's. The political economy is dismal science. And then on top of that, but Malthus starts modifying his approach. He went through, I think, 7 or 8 editions before he passed away, and he traveled a lot. He read things, and he said that there's a third force at work, not just the demand, urge for food, and the sex drive, but there's also man's ability for moral restraint. Moral restraint. It is possible for men to control their sexual passions, defer marriage until they have established themselves with an occupation, a profession, a way of earning a living, that they can support a family and children without such a burden of people relative to the food supply to cause this type of famine and plague. And he believed that people could that was a matter in their own self-interest, and that could be inculcated in them, like good values, good approaches that did not require an overthrow of the entire institutional order. Malthus's views have often been criticized. Many classical economists and 20th century economists view him as wrong, but not if you accept his underlying premise. And if you assume the agricultural technology before the Industrial Revolution, and if you understand that at his time there was no birth control, then all other things held given, there was and can be a tendency and a pattern that people can have far more children, far more than just replacing themselves, 2 children through the Sex Act, with no restraint or no prophylactics, that the number of mouths to feed can be exceeding the supply of food. As I mentioned last time, you see this in countries that have had socialism. They have no incentives. They have poor technology because of central planning and use of agriculture, and often there are famines and fate because the numbers exceed the ability of the system to provide food. But what Malthus could not anticipate was the Industrial Revolution and the technological innovations that enabled fertilizer and machinery and how to manage crops and genetically develop crops, that the food supplies could grow dramatically in excess of population, and people would slowly but surely, particularly in the 20th century, develop ways and then have them accepted in society for limiting reproduction of various forms of birth control. And in fact, the proof of this is the fact that when Malthus was writing, the global population is estimated to have been about 1 billion people, but out of that 1 billion people, approximately 90% lived in poverty. I mean, and many of them in abject poverty, global population. Today, the population is over 8 billion people, an 8-fold increase from 1 to 8 in a mere 200 years. But the amount of people in poverty or abject poverty is now less than 9%. So an 8-fold increase in the world's population, but from 90% in poverty to just 9% in poverty. And that's because of to the extent that innovation, technologies, and market opportunities have been allowed and been possible, Malthus's problem has been overcome. But it doesn't change the fact that in principle, given his assumptions, you can have that situation.
Okay. On that bright note, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. And then we'll start with Frederick Bastiat, which I'm sure...
Frederick Bastiat and a few other Frenchmen before we get into the evil Marx, not Groucho and Chico and Zeppo, but the evil Karl Marx.
All right. That sounds great. Thank you all for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you next week for part 4 of the Classical Economists. And Richard, enjoyed the conversation as always. Look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.